The G20 group of leaders is meeting this weekend for a summit in New Delhi, India. The summit, hosted under the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future, is set to discuss economic growth and reforms in multilateral banks, cryptocurrency policy and climate control. The declaration on Russia's invasion of Ukraine is said to have been left in limbo on Friday after disagreements on the draft summit declaration. Another important point on the agenda is the granting of the African Union membership in par with the European Union standing. Let's understand the impact of this summit further with development economist and Frontline Group CEO Dr. Jason Musyoka. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. It's a summit that brings together the world's most major and important economies. What do you imagine to be some of the biggest talking points and the significance of this gathering?
So thank you so much for inviting me today. So I think that the G20, which was established in 1999, there has been a transformation of what they really focus on. In 1999, G20 was established in the wake of the Asian crisis, and it really constituted not so much of presidents and so on, but central bank managers and key financial decision makers to try and contain crisis. It's very interesting that fast forward to 2008, the focus, again, they were quite effective, I should say. Assessment seems to suggest that the G20 really managed to, put some brakes into the free fall of the global crisis. But they have not really been successful in most of the other global emerging issues, and this includes issues of climate change, which they have participated, but not really been effective. COVID-19 is another that they have not been effective because it really is it's an informal club of, it doesn't have really teeth to bite. It cannot dictate what nation states do as far as their trade issues or economic decision making, macroeconomic policy making, and so on are concerned. So there's a limit to which, of course, they can influence national economic trajectories. But this is not to say that it's not consequential. I think issues of climate change that have become very critical are really on the table, and India is pushing for that. There's always a conversation around economic development in global south or poor countries, and that's also on the table as far as Indian presidency has been concerned throughout this year. So we do expect those conversations to pick up. And of course, as you rightly mentioned, the importance of Africa joining is the debate is ongoing now on what that might mean for the continent.
Yeah. As you touch on that, the African Union membership in par with the European Union standing, how much of an impact could that have on the AU, as well as looking at the interests of South Africa?
So it's always important to see the geopolitics that are on the background. And I think that to paint a very good picture on what's going on, you have the recent 15th BRICS summit that took place here in South Africa. And with that, there has been a push for expansion of BRICS. We've seen 20-plus countries joining, several of them joining from January 2024. That is now the BRICS. I think that China has been, of course, the natural leader in Global South. And because of the tensions going on now between China and the U.S., we've seen a Cold War II of sorts, where now you have these blocks that are currently existing, whether it's the G7 debates on its reformation. We've seen debates around reformation of the UN system, of course. But importantly now, the talking point that we are at, the G20 itself is really also trying to counterbalance what is going on, this expansion of BRICS. So the EU has been a standing member. African Union is an invited participant in the G20, but the push is for the AU to become a full member. And what that might mean, of course, is for Africa is access to markets. The AfCFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, is very consequential in this whole discussion. So the intention is for the Western markets, the G20 countries to access African markets, but also a quid pro quo where the AU is able to access the G20 countries as a market as well. And South Africa has been part of the G20, of course, as an independent nation state. So this is going to be additional over and above what South Africa has. And this has a lot to do with trade, of course.
Yeah. You talk about the BRICS, and of course we can't avoid the Russia-Ukraine war, which has also loomed large, not only this year, but in last year's G20 summit in Indonesia. But the group wasn't able to put together a hurried declaration that noted the differences within the G20 over the war. We know that the nations are divided on many issues, with the biggest being the war in Ukraine, of course, following Russia's invasion. Despite these agreements, India has been pushing hard for members to agree to a declaration of some sort. What would happen if this summit ends without one? Because we understand that these talks have been left in limbo.
So China and Russia have been very vocal concerning even the wording on the position of the G20 regarding the Ukraine issue. And China has said it will veto, of course, the rest of the G20 countries. There is a pushback with the EU being there. So China is still disadvantaged, as is Russia, given that the greater veto power lies with the rest of the G20 members. And that being said, I think that there is a risk here that is emerging as far as particularly the Ukraine issue is concerned, because the African Union, for the most part, abstained in February this year from voting, against Russia. There are others that stood with Russia. South Africa being critical as far as supporting Russia, although the public rhetoric has been non-alliance. But non-alliance, as far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned, is really alliance with Russia. That's given. So given that the AU seems to be much more aligned to Russia, Russia has pledged grains to most of the African countries, there is a possibility here that if African Union is given sufficient veto power, then you are going to see a much more robust democratic expression within the G20 itself. And that would, of course, attract maybe a much more stronger and bolder African Union, so that it's not arguing from the sidelines but from within the G20 itself.
Yeah, I mean, positions have hardened since Chinese and Russian leaders Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will not be attending. What sort of impact can we read out of this, especially when it comes to overall decision making at the summit?
So both Russia and China, they consider themselves as the prefects of the BRICS, and with the expansion, of course, that is significant achievement. India has been largely sitting on the fence, not least because, of course, it holds the presidency now. It's a bit tricky for Global South because Brazil holds the G20 presidency next year and South Africa in 2025. And I suppose the important question that one should be looking at is whether these are efforts to try and dilute the impact or the forcefulness of BRICS. But that being said, as far as Russia and China are concerned, there is a lot of confidence that the BRICS is the future, and they are really pushing for that. And abstaining from the G20 is also sending a message that the kind of multilateralism that the G20 has governed and pushed over the last 20-some years is really coming to an end. There is an emergence. And so I think it's still part of those geopolitics playing, and China and Russia pushing for their own Global South bloc. Keep in perspective, Paul, that during the G20 summits, the discussions are by and large guided by the most industrialized countries. The BRICS seems to now focus on South-South trade, South-South cooperation, and those are not discussions that are very welcome within the G20 by the very definition of the G20 itself. And I think that China thinks that it's going to push forward with BRICS and maybe counterbalance the G20.
Thank you very much. Let's perhaps leave it there for now.